Welcome to Civil War Digital Digest. I'm Will. Well, this looks a lot different than you normally see us in Digest episodes, but let me tell you, the coming sunset is a wonderful time for a torchlit parade if you're a member of the Wide Awakes in the campaign of 1860. Let's talk about it today. So let's talk about what we're not going to talk about. There are plenty of pundits and news reporters who are willing to talk ad nauseum with you about modern politics and the modern political parties. We're not going to do that. Let's look at the young Republican Party as it was in 1860. Today, we hear people talk about the Democrats as the big tent, lots of people coming in. That really applies very well for a Republican Party in 1860. They talk about having know-nothings, free soilers, abolitionists, a few Democrats, and old Whigs, all as part of the party. They've really got the big tent. What else is going on? We talk about a grand old party today. The fact of the matter is it is not a grand old party. The Republican Party is about 6 years old. It's in its second presidential election. So this is a young machine working, and we're going to talk about young men in that young machine tonight. Who were the Wide Awakes? Well, the Wide Awakes are a political club within the Republican Party that gets formed in the winter of 1860. Specifically, Cassius Clay was doing a series of speeches, and he was in Hartford, Connecticut, and he was being escorted in a torchlit parade by some young men to go to where he gave a speech. And several of the young men decided to protect their clothing. They would get capes and caps to go ahead and keep the dust and any embers off of their good clothing. Everybody loved the look, and within a couple of weeks in early March 1860, these men formed the first club and called themselves the Wide Awakes. Two of the men in that original organization are Henry Sperry and James Chalker. Throughout the rest of the year, Sperry, who is an aspiring newspaperman, will go on to write many tracts and leaflets to support the Republican machine and to support the Wide Awakes. Chalker is a dry goods salesman, and it's rumored that he sold personally over 20,000 Wide Awake cape and cap sets. Well, the idea takes off across the North with young men interested in militarism and the militia look. These groups formed looking like militia companies, at least in their rhetoric. They were certainly political clubs, but they used captains, lieutenants, sergeants, pioneers, and they marched in rank and file. So this is the style they took as they were marching on their candidate to victory. Something different in 1860 from 2020 is the fact that the Republican National Convention took place way earlier in the year. May 16 to 18, 1860 was the Republican National Convention in Chicago, Illinois. There were already several Wide Awake clubs there, and it took off like wildfire afterwards across the North, especially where there was close contention with Democratic contenders. So you don't see Wide Awake clubs as popular in Michigan, which is a Republican stronghold, but in Connecticut, where you've got Democratic challengers, or in Chicago, Illinois, where you have Stephen Douglas coming from Illinois, you're going to see more Wide Awakes. Matter of fact, by the time of the election, there were 48 separate Wide Awake clubs in Chicago alone. So what were the Wide Awakes? Well, the Waupun, Wisconsin Wide Awakes left their constitution behind, and here we get a chance to listen to what they thought their mission was.
1. To act as a political police. 2. To do escort duty to all prominent Republican speakers who visit our place to address our citizens. 3. To attend all public meetings in a body and see that order is kept and that the speaker and meeting is not disturbed. 4. To attend the polls and see that justice is done to every legal voter. 5. To conduct themselves in such a manner as to induce all Republicans to join them. 6. To be a body joined together in large numbers to work for the good of the Republican ticket.
We hear that in the political side. What they're not saying is also there's a very active social side. The Wide Awake is a club, and at a time when people needed a chance to gather, you go ahead and you get the Wide Awakes, and this is a nice social gathering. Some of the clubs, after forming their constitution, the first order of business might be to have a good event to invite the local ladies to. We know wide awakes are often spoken of as young, and they decided to have their young lead them across the country. Very well known to have young leadership, and that's the reason why Huck tonight is dressed as our captain, and I'm dressed in rank and file. There are men up into their 40s in the wide awakes, but the leadership was often very young. So let's go ahead and take a look at what the wide awakes wore and what we have to interpret it tonight. First, the capes and caps that they talked about. Let's start with the capes. Out of the wide awakes' own information, they talk about how the capes would be trimmed. The captain wearing red, the lieutenants wearing blue, the sergeants wearing white, and then there's no mention of the men, so when I made this one, we went ahead and left it plain. The caps are sort of the same way. As we look at original photos of the wide awakes, we see quite a range, as there would be for any grassroots organizations. You see kepis like Huck and I are wearing. You see wheel hats made out of tarred material. You see shakos. All sorts of options. For my rank and file look, I'm wearing a black kepi, and Huck, we have an original that was reproduced, and it has multiple colors. We believe this works well for the captain of the club. Another option for Wide Awake Club members is they might buy jewelry. We do have an example of a Wide Awake pin that was worn over a cockade. They talk about a torchlit parade. Well, it depends where you are in the parade as to what torch you're carrying. We have Huck holding the banner tonight, and this is reproduced out of one that's in Springfield, Illinois, in the state house there. But as the captain, Huck would be carrying a lantern, is what the Wide Awakes told us. The men in the rank and file, they're carrying torches, and the chances are the men often were told they had to provide their cap and cape, and then many of the clubs charged a fee or a due or a rental, so the torches were provided by the club. It's Civil War Digital Digest. We like to look at originals wherever possible, and the campaign torches set in the stands on either side of us, we have originals to look at. The one on my left is patterned directly from an original owned by Mitch Kreidel, and the one on the right looks a lot like an original that we see here, courtesy of Shane Seeley and Wide Awake Films. As a big, tall guy, I'm carrying a Pioneer's torch. There's a great look at this around election time, a drawing of Abe Lincoln holding something like this. The Pioneers were the biggest fellas on the flank, and they had multiple wick torches. If you know anything about military drill, think of this as your guides for your company. So they had to march in parades. They had to learn. Some of these men were learning from militia officers. Some of these men were learning, the different clubs were learning from retired Army officers. In Galena, Illinois, a shopkeeper who was formerly an Army officer, Ulysses Simpson Grant, comes out and teaches the local Wide Awakes the basics of Hardee's tactics. Different Wide Awake chapters mentioned they used Hardee's for drill, and they mentioned several pages. For those of you who know military drill, they talk about marching by the flank and forming by company into line. If you're not as fluent with the drill that we use in living history, these are the building blocks and the very elementary things. It'll make a parade look good, and it's fairly easy to teach rather quickly. Hans Christian Hegg, who will go on to command the 15th Wisconsin, leads his Wide Awake chapter in Wisconsin. Something else that happens as the Wide Awakes try to support each other and try to move the election for Lincoln, they go and visit. So a Wide Awake company in one town may go to the next town over and go ahead and march in the parade. We see some wonderful woodcuts out of Harper's of gigantic Wide Awake parades in New York in October. You read about that. You see just line on line on line on Wide Awake Club members marching in ranks, carrying banners, having the lit torches, and parading for Lincoln as you head up to the 1860 election. Wherever you end up seeing groups of men moving around during a time of controversy, and any political election is a time of controversy. Do you want this candidate? Do you want that candidate? Well, this is a time when things can erupt and go wrong. There were a few scrapes, there were a few fights. There was even one really big one in Stones Prairie, Illinois. But generally, these were political things. These weren't men looking out for a fight. One thing that's worth looking back on, and maybe a cautionary tale today as we learn how we interact with each other, the Wide Awakes were a political movement. They were there to support the Republican Party to beat the other candidates. This wasn't a militia. This was a political club. Now, when you go down south, take a look at what they see. They see Lincoln rallying, tons of men marching, and suddenly you hear a Texas newspaper say,
"The young and daring element of abolitionism is, for the first time, enthused with something like a love for military prowess." Austin State Gazette.
And there's concern about military prowess, and then very shortly after, it's followed by a comment from Virginia that mentions that the Wide Awakes would
carry rails to break open our doors, torches to fire our dwellings, and beneath their long black capes, the knives to cut our throats.
It's one thing that really is a good cautionary tale for all of us to watch what we say and where. These weren't the intended consequences of the Wide Awake. They were there to get Lincoln elected. But for somebody who was already fearful, what they saw was something completely different. Whatever's seen, whatever's known, the Wide Awakes were part of the fabric of the American political discussion in 1860. They did a huge job working to get President Lincoln elected in November. Many of them stayed through and actually offered to be part of the inauguration. Those were turned down. Many of these men would go on in the years. They have learned the words captain and lieutenant. In a year later, many of them would take up ranks and wear the Union blue, and it would be other captains and lieutenants, and this time instead of torches, it would be muskets as the United States devolved into civil war. Well, there's a quick review of the Wide Awakes in the 1860 presidential election. This grassroots organization did a lot to get President Lincoln elected. There's a lot to see here and a lot of stories. I hope you used it to find a small connection to the American experience as we're on the eve of the Civil War. Thanks for spending your time with Civil War Digital Digest. We'll see you soon.